We are a network of learning analytics researchers and practitioners here at NYU. First, what is learning analytics for some of you that maybe are not that familiar with the term? Learning analytics is a new field of educational research that, different from other fields, try to analyze large amounts of data about the learning process with the purpose of feeding that information back to the learning process stakeholders. That means students, teachers, advisors, administrators. So instead of analyzing the processes and writing a nice paper and publish that paper, the goal of learning analytics is taking the data, analyzing it, and giving it back immediately. So this feedback loop is part of the intrinsic definition of learning analytics. So today, we will be talking about how that feedback loop will look and looks into academic advising. So let me just, before we start, if you want to learn a little bit more about what learning analytics is, where it is used, a very good place to start is our Learning Analytics 101. It's a free online available primer where you can read about, go to the scientific literature. It's classified in topics. It's a very good resource to get into the field. And just an announcement before we start. In 2 weeks' time, we have another conversation about the use of learning analytics in large introductory courses. So if you want to also attend that, please make your RSVP. Okay, let's focus on today's talk. Today, we will be talking about how we can use learning analytics into student success in academic advising, how we can augment the capacity of academic advisors in higher education institutions. For this, I have the pleasure to present you our 2 main speakers, Dr. Tinne De Laet. She is an associate professor at Leuven in Belgium. She chairs the tutorial service of engineering science, a service that advises and supports students through their engineering studies. Her research seeks ways to bring artificial intelligence and learning analytics to the advising practice. We also have today Dr. Kyle Jones. He's an assistant professor at Indiana University-Indianapolis in the United States. He researches information ethics and policies issues, such as student privacy, trust, associated with learning analytics in the context of American higher education. To moderate this conversation, we have Dr. Emily Schlam. She is Senior Director of Student Success here at NYU. In her role, she serves as a subject matter expert and consultative resource for university partners on issues related to student retention, graduation, and enhancing the student experience. Her research focuses on organization complexity with higher education and their impact on student retention and persistence. With much further ado, please, we will start with Tinne, please, and you can take the floor.
Thank you, Xavier, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Here we go. So it's my pleasure here to talk to you about artificial intelligence for academic advising. And my title is it a matter of trust? So as Xavier mentioned, I'm a researcher, but I'm also heading the tutorial service of engineering science. It's an actual service where my colleagues are advising students in their first year, especially in higher education. So in my research, I try to combine the research part of learning analytics, but also the practical part. So student advisor, student conversations on study progress are in a typical setting where a student comes with some questions like, should I consider another program? Can I still finish the bachelor in 3 years? How should I compose my program for the next year? And at the other end of the table, you have the student advisor who's trying to find out what the personal situation is of the student, how she could help, and what are the next best steps to take. In a previous research, we have been developing a dashboard for student advising that was only based on data we could gather from our university system. So mainly it was showing for the different semesters here, what were the actual study results on the different courses. The study advisor would get some additional information, so they could also see some histograms to see how students were doing on the course in general. They also had some particular ways to compare students and how they were evolving over time compared to the entire cohort. And we also developed some particular modules to plan for the future. So how could they plan their study load for the future? And this is something particular to the Belgian system. How could they tolerate some courses they had mildly failed? The first only part that was a little bit challenging, I must say, for people to accept is the one you see here. So here you would see for 3 groups of students how they past cohorts were doing in the future. So if I would zoom into this one, so we are dividing students in 3 groups. These are the low performing groups, the medium performing groups, and the high performing groups. And then based on their study results, you could see for students in the past, which part of these students, which percentage would finish the bachelor's in nominal time, 3 years, 1 year more, 2 years more, or would drop out. So people would sometimes see this as a prediction, but it's actually not a prediction. It's just a visualization of the how students were doing in the past. So we have been developing this dashboard widely, and currently it's being implemented throughout the entire university. So Leuven is a general university with 50,000 students in all different kind of disciplines. And so this is being implemented university-wide right now. But as I mentioned, this is very descriptive. So we were also tackling a new problem, and it was conversations with aspiring students, so students that would like to come to our degree. And then they would ask us questions like, can I be successful in engineering? How can I better prepare myself for the program? And what are my strengths and weaknesses? On the other end of the table, you have the study advisor that wants to know what's driving the student, why the student is doubting, and how she or he could advise the student. So here we're doing a little bit more. So we were still taking student and academic data, but then we were applying machine learning to create a predictive model of student success. And then we were creating a dashboard, a visualization that student advisors could use to show these predictions to the students. So you would bring such a black box predictive model to the table. And then, of course, people would perceive this in a way like, what is this black box doing? It's like a gambling game. Suddenly it predicts the student will be successful, this one fails, without really understanding what's going on. So it would show something like, warning, the probability for you to be successful is 23%, but you would not have any clue why it's doing this and how you could advise the student. So you would know why it's doing this and how, which recommendations can I give. So what we wanted to do is then to bring these predictions for study success to the advising practice by incorporating them in a learning analytics dashboard, such that we can provide database support for advising, that we can professionalize our study advising. But of course, we have to take into account some legal matters, financial matters, etc. But most important, and that's the focus of my presentation here, we want to get rid of this algorithmic opacity. Because you have this black box there on the table, and if people don't know what it's doing, it will alienate them from the process. They will not trust it. And moreover, in Europe, we have now the GDPR regulation, which tells us every student has a right for explanation if there is a predictive model used. So you have to be able to explain to the user what's happening. So that's why we are using the methodology of explainable AI to open up the black box of this predictive model. So we said, okay, explainable AI is coming to the rescue, and it will help us to bring this predictive model to advising practice. But if you look how study advisors are advising, they already have their mental model of what makes students successful. And then you bring to the table this algorithmic output, a machine learning model. And then you can see that if these two match, then people are really wanting to use this kind of predictive model because it supports their story. They can use it to strengthen their story to the student. But you're in trouble when they don't match. So if the mental model of the advisor is telling something else than the machine learning model. So what we are trying to do in our research is to see how these mental models of study advisors work, what they are thinking, and how they match with the explanations of the algorithm, and then if this is influencing on how they are using this algorithm. algorithmic outputs. So this is my university. You also see it in the background. This is our library. What is quite important to know on our background is that we are very large and general. And we have a lot of students that are failing in our programs. And it's because we don't have a national exam. We have very low registration fees, so we're a very democratic higher education institute, and we are not allowed to select any students. So any student that would like to come to study at our university, they can just enter in the bachelor programs, even if they don't have the right preparation. So this is a typical graph in our programs where we have a dropout, of around here on the right, 40% in the bachelors. So there's really a need to explain better to aspiring students what would make them successful and how can they can start in a stronger way to the program. So we were taking our data. We have data on prior academic achievement, like on the preparation of students. And then we also take questionnaires with students that are showing how their learning and study skills are. Then we are putting this in our algorithmic model, and then we can predict academic achievement of a student after one semester. So we would say, based on this background characteristic, how successful is a student? Then we classify them in 3 groups: no risk, which means they will probably be successful; at risk, where we think they probably will be failing; and something in between. Now, you have this predictive model, and then you have to start to explain it to the user. Why is this being predicted as at risk or not? And then we're using a local, interpretable, model-agnostic explainer. Local means it's a very complex environment. You just take the neighborhood of the particular students where you'll be approximating the algorithm. Interpretable, it means you make sure you try to understand what's happening. And for instance, here, this is just a picture from another paper where a doctor is predicting if the patient is having a flu or not. And you can see, for instance, it's predicting the patient has a flu because he's sneezing and has a headache. That's our things that are contributing to the prediction to be sick, but no fatigue. The patient is not tired, so this is not supporting your prediction. So you show why it's making the prediction. Model agnostic, it means you can do it for any machine learning algorithm. So what did we build? So here you can see what we have been building, but I rather show you something live. Yes. So here you can see a student. So you enter the student number, and then you can see the prediction of the algorithm. So this is the black box. The black box is telling there's 12% probability the student is at no risk, and there's 57% probability that the student is at risk. And then you can see here below the explanation. So these are the features of the student, like his hours of mathematics, his percentage of chemistry, his motivation, etc. And then the colors are showing which features are contributing for the students to be not at risk. So the green ones are his strengths. Because he has a good hours of mathematics, that is contributing to the no risk prediction. You could also see the weaknesses of a student. So why is the algorithm thinking that the students will fail? That's mainly because he has a low concentration level and a very low effort level that is being reported. So like this, you can really see strengths and weaknesses. And on top, you could also simulate what would happen if a student would have been doing a better effort level, so that you can also see what the impact would be if you advise a student to improve on something particular. Okay, so this is just showing what we have been building. I'm going to skip this. So we have been trying this with our study advisors, not with real students yet, just with simulated students. And there we say, what did they find useful? So first, they thought that the visualization itself is really nice, but they are fearing for a cognitive overload. So they're saying there's a lot of information, so we really have to be careful on how we're going to use it in the end. They think it's usable, so that's more like a standardized questionnaire. They thought it was a good tool to use. They think the explanations are really helpful because it shows the situation of the students and the strengths and the weaknesses of the students. And you can find ways for the students on how they can improve. They also tell it's a trigger for conversation. So they see an explanation and then they start digging deeper. They start to ask students, oh, why didn't you have a high effort level in secondary school, etc. But still, advisors are very careful about, they think you should be careful about the use of predictive algorithms and that you should not use them blindly. They really like the interactive visualization where they could play with features, because sometimes they want to go along with the story of a student, like, no, in reality, my mathematics is higher than the test has been measuring, and then you could simulate that. So we have been saying this earlier, and we confirmed it in our conversation. So we mainly have a problem when the predictive model is not matching with the mental model. So I just want to conclude. So with these explanations, we try to bring black box machine learning algorithms to practice. We think they can really contribute to advising practice, that can make study advisors and students more aware and make them reflect. They help to understand what's going on in the black box prediction models, and they can also help to lower the mistrust in these algorithms in case there's a conflict with the mental model. Of course, we should always be careful about cognitive overload if you're using these in actual conversations. In the future work, we want to include this also in more advising practice and test it with students. And then it still remains to show the real impact of these explainers on utility, understanding, and then the trust of both advisors and students. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Tinne. Excellent, great presentation. Kyle, please, it's your turn.
Sure, thank you very much. Give me a second to set up here.
By the way, you can add questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you want to pose some questions, please do.
Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see that. And then in the chat, I just put the slides for everyone to download should they so choose. There may be a few parts of this I need to blow through just because of time. But we'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit about me. Xavier did an excellent job of introducing me, but I am an information ethics and policy scholar focused on educational data mining and learning analytics in higher education, very much interested in privacy, intellectual freedom, and trust issues. And you can find out all about the work that I do, my grant projects, my research teams at my website, thecorkboard.org. So a very brief outline of today's presentation. I'll talk a little bit about information flows and outputs as they relate to advising analytics. I think that's extremely important. I'm going to bring up professional advising role or values, and this is within the context of North America, just to be particular about that. And then I want to talk about privacy's role in advising analytics, and especially I should say, privacy's instrumental role. So first off, advising analytics, information flows and outputs. So first off, I want to be very clear that the points I'm going to make today are not necessarily about the work that Tinne and her colleagues make. It's not research work that I'm making points about. It's more about actual built systems developed by vendors that are sold to institutions and then the institutions implement. So I think that some of the criticisms perhaps I make are much more aligned to the vendor-based products. So first off, I just want to talk about infrastructures here. We have a very large data infrastructure and information infrastructure built up in higher education institutions. And the different parts of this infrastructure have been previously disconnected from each other. They worked in silos, right? They serve different needs: education, security, residence halls, so on and so forth. But increasingly, these things are becoming connected to each other. And to me, they're being connected in two different ways. These systems are coming with APIs that allow for crosstalk between systems, so that allows for the direct sharing of data between systems. Or, and this is also happening, it's not an either-or situation, institutions are developing data warehouses that can suck in and organize the data from these disparate systems and then connect them together. And what happens then is that it enables relationality that allows for analytics. And relationality is really database design 101. It allows you to take a thing or things and append it to what I call a core analytical target. So if we're interested in studying a student, we have the student's grades, but now we can get some of their behaviors based on their card swipe data, and we can add in survey data that they have taken for career services, or we can look at things like Wi-Fi access in the library, and all connect that to a student's life. That datifies the student, and it helps us develop a very comprehensive student profile for comparison between student groups, for analysis, and then also to do predictive modeling. So we have a very immense data and information infrastructure that allows for advising analytics and other learning analytics. And I often argue many of our commercial friends would love to have access to the data that we have access to in higher ed. So advising analytics, just to be clear, we're not looking at just grades here. We're looking at socioeconomic demographics, academic demographics. We're looking at behavioral data, so geolocation-based tracking. We could also be looking at things like attendance, where students are and when for a particular course, or if they're in a library, or if they're at a writing center or so forth. And rolling this in, we could start to do predictive measures about that student. So will they be successful in a course or a program, or for entirely different purposes, like is there a predicted retention rate, which is really important to American higher education institutions. And with this information, we can start to target our communications a little bit better to these students. And some of these communications are automated, meaning that they're just nudges based on an algorithm. They say, well, if the student meets condition X, then send this message. Or, as is the case with data dashboards, they inform advisors who then make manual communications, or send manual communications out to their advisees. So there are a variety of cases of advising analytics, and if you're looking at this slide here, you're probably noticing a lot of the big names that have come up in advising analytics over the last probably 5 to 7 years. I want to focus in on the Campus Labs Beacon tool real quick, because I find this one the most interesting. And I find it the most interesting because of the way that it sucks in a lot of data from disparate sources, like I talked about previously. So this will allow institutions to bring in student activity data gathered from ID card swipes used at campus events. And then using triggers set up by advisors, the system can set in motion those automatic interventions that I talked about. So if a report comes out that the student felt socially disengaged, then campus housing actually can gain access to this information and alert the student's resident advisor about their disengagement, and then provide an intervention. So I think it's interesting when we talk about advising analytics, sometimes it's not just about the advisor gaining access to the information, but it's a wide variety of other institutional actors as well. So pillars of advising analytics: tracking, gathering that information, analyzing it, doing that descriptive profile work and predictive modeling, and then intervening to affect some type of change, either through face-to-face advising or technological advising. I want to talk about professional values, because professional values are really important when we talk about ethics. So I'm pulling these principles in the next coming slides from NACADA, which is one of those organizations that used to be an abbreviation and no longer has any meaning. It's just NACADA now, from what I can tell. But it's the Professional Association for Advisors, and they represent North American institutions in their advising organization. Or their advisors, I should say. So there are some core values about NACADA to bring up. They care about their students. They are committed to excellence in their students with regard to student success. They want to empower their students, or their advisees, I should say. They want to motivate, encourage, support students. They want to be inclusive, create environments that support diverse needs and perspectives of students. Also, they want to act with integrity, so they want to be honest, they want to be transparent, they want to be accountable to the student, to the institution, and the advising profession, and I'll get to that in a second. And obviously, hopefully most professionals would agree with this. They want to act with professionalism in accordance with these values. And they want to show respect. They want to value all students. They want to build those relationships that understand and appreciate students' views and cultures and backgrounds. These are all great core values to have. The question is, how do these things align with advising analytics tools, or sometimes come in conflict with these things? So I want to distill some of these components from these values. So I think that if you look at those stated values, advisors agree that personhood is a thing, that students are diverse individuals and should be treated as diverse individuals, kind of regardless of their demographics, regardless of their educational, professional interests, etc. They want to help students grow personally and academically. And they want to do that by developing successful relationships with their advisees that include trust, right? And are focused on care and transparency and respect. And that advisors have political and technological power through the use of their advising tools, but they want to use these tools and their power for good, right? To motivate, to support, to care for their advisees. But that leads to some very key questions. Advisors have responsibilities to students and their colleagues and their institution. And in those value statements, what I appreciated is that students were always put forward first, but do student interests always win out, right? How does an advisor make or balance choices when using analytics, especially with regard to student success? Because student success may mean one thing for the individual student, but means something else entirely for the institution. Advisors rely on extensive information about their advisees, so to what extent do students get to limit advisors' access to that information? And also advisors have to make choices, right? Do they prioritize advising for students who are unlikely to be retained, unlikely to find success in a course? Or do they say, well, those students are going to fall off a cliff anyway, so I'm going to put my attention toward the students who are kind of in the middle somewhere, or who are likely to meet those metrics of student success, however defined. So what I want to do right now is home in on privacy. I want to specifically look at a couple of different elements of privacy: intellectual freedom, autonomy, and relational socialization in its role in advising analytics. So I want to be really clear here that privacy is an umbrella value. It can be defined in a lot of different ways. You can read Daniel Solov's work on all of the various approaches to privacy. But I tend to argue that privacy is contextually situated. So higher education, as a context, is generally accepted that student privacy is valued for its instrumentality, and that means that it helps students, privacy helps students accomplish other valuable things while they're students. So student privacy concerns the implementation of data and information practices that protect, and here are the three instrumental values, students' intellectual interests. In protecting those intellectual interests specifically from influence. That's intellectual freedom. Privacy helps students so that they can make their own choices for their own reasons. That's autonomy. And that privacy helps with the process of developing personal and academic relationships without producing uneven information disclosures. That's relational socialization. So when and I want to be a little clearer about this because I think it's perhaps a little ambiguous. When we try to engage in new relationships or in the maintenance of relationships, we are actively disclosing specific types of information to another individual or individuals. And we do that according to what we want to get out of that relationship and what power or control we have in that relationship. So depending on the power that we have, that helps us to develop those relationships, curate those relationships, or conclude them, as the case may be. So let's dig into advising analytics, and specifically here, intellectual freedom. So my concern is that if there's any system or practice that attempts to direct students to take up particular materials, or to have certain experiences, or to pursue courses or degree programs, it must not do so in a way that denies the student's ability to pursue their own intellectual interests. It's their degree, they're paying for it, at least in America. They're paying for it, they're choosing to pursue something because they have an interest in it. It's not up to the institution, the advisor, the faculty member to force them or use their power to direct them in a particular way. And that's because the institutional actors in the technology they use express power. Right? Students defer to faculty members. They defer to advisors. We have to be careful with how we use technologies and power. And that means that the careful framing, education, and transparency must be used with advising analytics. What about autonomy? So it's likely unclear to students that they can make choices that run counter to the suggestions that they get in advising technologies or by the advisors who look at those technologies. So student choices may not align with institutional goals, right? But advisors have to respect those because it's their life. They have very specific situations, very particular interests, and they want to make decisions in alignment with those things. So students should never be pushed or coerced or even shamed using analytics into a decision over which they have no say. And relational socialization here. So advisors are gaining access to significant amounts of data and granular data about information, and that puts them in a position of power over their advisees when they have these conversations. They may gain access to really sensitive information about, potentially health records, geolocation, or other types of predictive analytics. And these things should only be disclosed on a limited basis, and I would argue, hopefully, with student consent. I'm not exactly sure how to do this, to be honest with you. This is very tricky, and I'll leave this to Tinne and other HCI-specific researchers to look into the messaging around some of this information and the way that we can develop kind of privacy and consent mechanisms. But regardless, I think advisors should always fall back on developing those trustworthy relationships with the students and not necessarily on the data and analytics for which they have access. These things should be used in combination, but really what should be relied on is that relationship development. So these are all principles for advising analytics: intellectual freedom, autonomy, and relational socialization as a way to protect students' privacy and still make efficacious actions or have efficacious actions in advising. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. Now to guide us through the conversation, Emily, please.
Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear me. Hi, great. I think we're going to jump into our panel conversation. And I just have to say, wow, I just learned so much. I think everyone on the call probably just learned a lot as well. So thank you, Kyle and Tinne, for running us through that. And I think as everyone can see, there's a lot of overlap between the conversations we just had and the work that's being done in student success and academic advisement, especially here at NYU. So I see a lot of friendly faces from NYU as well on the session. So looking forward to hearing those questions after we have a little bit of a conversation. So I wanted to kick us off, and I think both of you touched on this in your presentation, around the adoption of learning analytics tools for academic advisement, right? So in complex and decentralized organizations like higher education, the adoption of systems can sometimes present a challenge. This can especially be challenging for groups and areas like academic advisors, many of whom are already being asked to utilize multiple systems when working with students and have very limited time to do that. So to support the adoption of learning analytics tools for academic advisement, what are your suggestions for the best way to introduce these tools to advisors? And maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the suggestions for involving them in the design process in a way that will help buy-in and make people open to using the tool to gain the most benefit in the academic advising space.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic, and I want to reflect back on the process we've gone through to the original dashboard I was showing, which was very descriptive. And I think the last part of your question is a part of the solution. Like if you design the dashboards together with the study advisors, rather than guessing what they would need and imposing an algorithm on them or imposing a visualization on them, then you really are already halfway through, because then you can develop together with them something that would support their process. And then maybe don't see it as an add-on on something they have to do, but as being a supportive tool in a conversation they're already having with students. So that's what we really tried to do in that respect. But then still it was quite challenging to deploy to the entire university. And because then you have to connect to policymakers, which have to also align with the process that's being done. And maybe they are not always have their priorities on student advising, they have their priorities elsewhere. And then, of course, you need what we are doing, usually building prototypes. And here we really built a little bit of a product, but it's not integrated into the university systems. And our IT will say, no, we're not supporting that because we didn't build it. So they either buy something very expensive, which is maybe not well suited to the target audience, or they have to developing something themselves. So in our process, they really redeveloped the dashboard entirely from scratch, but then well informed about our processes. And now it's fully integrated and we're offering training, etc. So I think this is a nice process, but it took 7 years.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I'll tell you the worst way to introduce these tools with advisors, and that's to just force advisors to use them. That is the best way to get the worst adoption rate for advising analytics. If the optimal condition, which I think is what Tinne is getting at, isn't available to advisors, which is to integrate them into the development of the technology from the ground up, then the next step would be to at least include them in the adoption process from the beginning by looking at the vended options and saying which tools are easy to use, which tools accomplish our goals, and which tools align with our values, right? Come up with that heuristic and do an examination with the advisors, with at least a committee of advisors, to figure out what tools are going to fit your needs. I did the one research paper I did on advising analytics, because I've done a lot of stuff on privacy, but I did one interview-based research paper on advising analytics, and that's what happened. They were forced to adopt a tool, and instead of actually using the analytics that were built into it, they decided, well, we don't trust it because it was forced on us. Some administrator said, go ahead and use this thing. And then when they didn't use it, the administrator saw that they weren't using it and yelled at them. And then the advisor said, well, we're just going to log into it occasionally to kind of put them off the trail, right? That's a terrible situation for all involved, and it's a waste of the few resources we have in higher education.
All really great points, and I think things that we can learn as we are deciding which tools we want to use, how we want to use them in kind of the advising space. So I want to shift a little bit to kind of the role of the advisor and how these tools may change the role of an advisor and how that should happen, or should that happen. So we know that advising is time-consuming work. Advisors can have large caseloads. They're building relationships with students, but at the same time, we're asking them to be efficient and assist students in making important and timely decisions that impact their student success metrics, right? Retention, graduation, and experience. So how is the role of the advisor changed by these tools? What is different or should be different if advisors are using a learning analytics tool to have a conversation around academic advisement?
Yeah, maybe I can go here first as well. So the first thought is I hope it will never change their role, because I think they have a very important role. Usually they are well trained. They really have a heart for what they are doing. They're trying to do the best. I think the best that the analytics should do is supporting them in their role. And maybe it can help them to build like a little bit more of a database view on the population, which doesn't mean they have to treat the student as a data, but they can use it as a background so that they are well informed, that they feel they have all the information they need to give good advice to students. But I remember the first time when we presented our dashboard to our vice rector, he said, oh, then we could save time for the study advice and they could do more students. I said, that was exactly the opposite of our idea. We hoped that they would have more time for an actual conversation and less time putting data together from sources they would find somewhere and trying to figure out what the dropout is in the program or where students are logging into the system and when. No, let's make their life easier. Let's ask them what they need to give a good advice. And yeah, it should not change their role, but just strengthen their role. So let's please stay away from universities with automatic advising systems.
Yeah, Tinne said everything. There's not a whole lot that I could or should even try to add to that. I mean, that's my biggest fear, though, is that with any learning analytic, not just advising analytic systems, is that they'll try to push away the professional roles in higher education or try to rearrange them in a particular way that meets some type of efficiency metric or some type of or a political outcome metric that they want to achieve, instead of actually using them as tools to support the professional, goals and expertise of the individual, whether that's the faculty member or the advisor or the librarian. So I think we should always be slightly concerned about any type of analytic coming into higher education, not because it may not be valuable. It could be immensely valuable, but we have to look at what's the motivation behind wanting to adopt these tools to begin with.
Excellent point, really. I think leaning into that kind of thought process, I want to shift the conversation to thinking about prediction versus information, right? So we're talking a lot about these tools being able to predict student success outcomes or provide really important conclusions. So that's one of the goals of learning analytics, right? Is to draw meaningful conclusions from a variety of data points, student interactions and other things. But from the work that you've done and the conversations you've had, what is the sweet spot between presenting raw data for advisors to interpret versus presenting a final decision or a recommendation made by an algorithm? And can you talk to us a little bit about maybe where you see that balance?
I think you probably saw from my presentation, I'm not very fond of just giving a prediction to advisors without any explanations. On the other hand, like just presenting the raw data can become very challenging because it's raw and it can be very highly dimensional, so that it's just impossible to get an overview and to get a meaningful interpretation from that. So I think it's can be the task of an algorithm to try to summarize this information to help help people dig deeper into the data. And I just want to connect also to deciding which data you want to use. I don't know if you've seen what kind of data I'm using. And most important is that we are not using particular data. Like we're not using gender, we're not using socioeconomic background. These variables, although they are very predictive for student success, but what kind of recommendation can you make from like, oh yeah, you're male, so your probability of being successful is 10% lower. The students will not change their gender to be more successful. That's entirely the wrong strategy. So I think that's also important, like which data are you showing and what will people do with this data? Like if you're presenting it to students, you have to present to them data that is actionable. Like we say, you can still, based on the actions you do, you can improve yourself. Like for instance, we are showing things on mathematics background, which is maybe not changeable, but you can still improve your mathematics level. So it's a proxy for something that you can still improve and change. So, and that's also why it's important to not only see how you visualize the data, but also which data you're using for which purposes.
Yeah, Tina, I like your optimism that some of us are able to increase our mathematics levels, but I was not that student at my undergraduate level. I got to a level and I was there. Luckily, I did well in other areas. But one of the things that I would say here is that I'm very concerned about just giving a student a predictive measure, right? I think that leads to self-fulfilling prophecies. So it's if that is the direction that advising analytics goes, then it needs to come with a lot of education for advisors, right? About how they can understand the underlying data, how the model got to that point, and how they're supposed to contextualize that metric for the student, right? So I would rather that not be the case. I'd rather just push that off the table and say, okay, advisors, you can look at the predictive measure, right? But it's up to you to tell a story around everything that you're going to provide to your advisee in terms of the support and the resources and the encouragement to, not take a certain direction, but about the opportunities in higher education. That being said, I think if you take the predictive measure away from the individual and you start to look at subgroups of students at a higher level, I'm actually more okay with that, right? Because we're not looking at identifiable students, we're looking at characteristics of the student body. And maybe there's something that we can get from that metric that helps us develop new programs or create new types of communications that are supportive, so on and so forth. So I think we can look at these things at different levels and say, well, this is a no-go and this is ethically okay and practically the way that we should go with predictive measures in some cases.
Could I still connect to that, Emily, a little bit? Because I think Kyle has been also saying something very important, that's training. And I think even if you don't go to predictive analytics and just to descriptive analytics, you already have the risk that people will start like over-interpreting the data. Like we had originally on the descriptive dashboards, like these 3 groups, and some people will tend to like lower the barriers until there is a 100% historic population that failed. And then they will give this advice to students, but it's totally wrong. That was not the idea of the dashboard. And we were also forcing them that they were not able to put a barrier there, but still people can use it like that. So it's really, even if your tool has the right reasoning behind it, people can still misuse it, maybe not because they want to do it wrong, but just because they didn't really understand the purpose of the system, the possible wrongdoing, etc. And that's why also this training and connecting to the actual practitioners is very, very important.
Excellent points. And I think we are using some of these tools in different ways. And I think we're learning over time, what's the best combination? What's the way to use this that's most beneficial to students? And also who's using it, right, at what time? So as advisors start to use these tools, what's the most valuable use of information and what way is it digestible and useful? I want to circle back to the students, because obviously they're the core of the work, why we're here, why we're doing this work. So learning analytics also offers the potential for more personalized learning and advising experiences, right? With more information, we can personalize those conversations. But also this presents an opportunity for students to engage with advisors in data about their interactions to make more informed decisions. So how much information in a learning analytics tool should be shared with a student? I know, Kyle, you've talked a little bit about this, and Tinne as well. What's beneficial, and is it ethical not to share all the information that's in a tool? And then also, if we could talk a little bit about maybe the best ways for advisors to use these tools to create structures where students can do some self-evaluation of the process.
I think it's a very important question. And honestly, at my university, we have been taking the approach a little bit differently, maybe, like, for instance, with data on their survey. So we have this learning and study skills survey. We don't give that data to student advisors, because why should we? If a student is not having a conversation with them, why should they have the data? And we are still establishing the trust with students that it's safe for them to use their data. So what we did is we built a dashboard, a visualization of these learning skills. And if they wanted to share the data to student advisor, they could offer them the key. And then they could include it in their advising practice. They could have a conversation around it. But we're still, I think, in my university and in Europe, I think, on the pace where we have that the students have data, and we still have to create trust that they are trusting us with the data. And I rather take a very careful approach where we're not including all this data in advising practice, because I'm very maybe afraid that they will start to mistrust the advisor. And that's the only thing really essential thing you want to prevent. You're having a relationship of trust, and that trust should be there. So I think it's more likely that we are now going on a way, if we want to include more data, that the student will be offering the data to the student advisor to help him together explore better pathways for the student, rather than the university trying to get a lot of data and without really having an official consent, including it in an advising system.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
I mean, I really like your question. Like, is it ethical to not share information with students? I mean, it sounds so counterintuitive, right? When we are educational institutions, we are about information, we are about knowledge, and then to try to hold back something from students specifically seems a little wrong in some ways. But transparency is not always a good thing, and information can be harmful. We all know that. We've been through that in the last 4 to 6 years with all of the misinformation. So I'm not saying that analytics are misinformation, but I'm saying that information can be internalized in a way that creates self-harm, right? So we have to protect against that self-harm. We have to protect against administrators or others using information to label students or to put them in a box or to somehow separate them from the institution altogether, which we have also seen happen with lower level analytics too. So yes, I think there are very good reasons to not disclose information to students or to particular individuals within the institution, and to only do so in ways that protect the student.
Great. So I think now we want to open up for Q&A. We have lots of people who are here listening, and I've seen some questions in the chat, but if you have a question, please raise your hand and come off mic, and we will be able to kind of navigate that conversation.
There was a question in the chat. It was Rafael. Rafael, you want to pose a question?
Well, I had two questions. One is about the model. In the case of the model presented, it was very nice, and it has very nice features, and it was very interactive. But in a sense, it was a kind of simple model with only a few dimensions. And in AI in education, we usually have larger models with many, because the computers are good for that, are good for getting a lot of details about the student. And so, for example, we are doing work with modeling competencies, and we have a lot of competencies to model. So the problem of visualization gets bigger. And I wonder if you have some advices on that kind of issues. And the other question was about the issue of, I agree with the concerns about the bad use or misuse of information from students. But on the other side, well, my feeling, because I'm more in Latin America, maybe, we cannot keep doing the same things with the new technology. Technology is going to change many things, and well, we have to be careful about what it changes, but we cannot keep doing the same things and the advisors doing the same job and providing the same kind of advice. And if we have powerful tools like the ones have been presented here.
Maybe I can respond to the first part of your question. Like you're right, in the visualization I showed, we have limited dimensions. You can still use the explainer if you have many dimensions, and it can just show the top features that are predictive for the being successful, or the weaknesses of a student. So you can help us to distinguish between the more important features and the less important features. But if you're building a predictive model, usually you have to do first a principal component analysis to put dimensions together, because they are very correlated, and otherwise you don't have not a good model. And this is very challenging for the explanation, because then you have like the correlated one, everything that's related to mathematics as being put in one big factor, and then your explanation will say this factor is important. And we've also seen in our users, then it alienates the user further, because they don't really see what is this factor altogether. They understand the individual dimensions, but they don't understand like the factor. So I think especially in higher dimensional problems, there's even a bigger issue in bringing these predictive models to the users.
I think we have one more question from Jinhao. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Hi, thank you guys so much. It's been really interesting. I have a question. Are there are you looking at any predictors aside from grades or retention? And could you imagine, like, aside from issues of grades and retention, what are other uses of these models?
in the future, we hope to also look to other outcome variables, which can be things like academic integration, which means like how well a student is able to fit into the program, and also in academic well-being. But then you also going on a little more challenging route, because you relate to psychosocial variables, etc. But maybe we have to look into it because we want to support students better in their integration in academic life. So it's something I hope to do, but we're still gathering data there on academic integration, especially.
I don't build the models, and you don't want me to, but I do have a comment here. So one of the things that I would be very interested in having a model built about would be engagement with the campus. So just put aside your yelling at me for a moment, considering everything I just said about ethics, right? Like, there is a lot of power in knowing on a campus what resources a student engages with, both in terms of physical resources and electronic resources, and also knowing the degree to which they are developing a network of peers, of colleagues, of doing that relational socialization that is so important. And if there is a valid model that could be built to demonstrate to a student that they're reaching a level of engagement that is predicted to be successful, or to show that they will have a more holistic experience in the university than if they just become recluses and hang out in their dorm rooms, that could be really powerful. But that would only work in my mind if a student would consent to that, right? And that also assumes that the institution can just flip a switch and say, okay, now we can get all their geolocation data, which comes with other problems too. But that's something I'm interested in.
I think we have time for one quick last question. I saw in the chat that Jonathan had asked about taking a critical and participatory approach. Have either of you seen systems, dashboards, analytics designed with students? This is obviously has other issues, but I'm curious. So that was from Jonathan Martinez.
There are definitely on the learning analytics part systems that have been designed together with students. Honestly, I also think that for the advising we do, we should include students more, because we're primarily working with the student advisors. It's a little bit easier. They're professional, they're trained, they already have the institutional vision they can include. And we find it a little bit more challenging to work from the first designs up together with students. But of course, they are involved later on. But honestly, I think maybe we should do better there and already try to include them from the beginning. And not only the student representatives, because they are typically a particular kind of students that are usually, often in our cases, advertising for the good students that are very well integrated, etc. But also students that are maybe more likely to struggle and that can give a particular view also on how you would work in advising with these students, because these students are in the end the ones that are more likely to show up or for an advising conversation.
Yeah, I can't recall the names of the authors, and I'm really apologetic for that. But there were one or two papers that came out within the last 3 or so years that specifically looked at student adoption of learning analytics generally, right? So if a predictive measure is within a course setting, an LMS, were students likely to act on that measure, to trust that measure? And I believe that there were two ways that they went about it. Just a general message, and then a message that was personalized from the instructor, right? And when that message was personalized from the instructor, then the students were more likely to take action on it, to respect it, to trust it, to think like this was worthwhile. So I think a lot of that work could definitely be applied as a model to advising analytics. And something I'm very interested in, this is what I was saying about HCI researchers, look into the communications, the phrases, the context, the not necessarily the timing, though of course that's important with these things, but how they're framed from the instructor or from the system. I think that will get you a far way forward in terms of adoption and use.
Great. Well, thank you both for such a vibrant and dynamic conversation. And I think we are at time. So thank you everyone else for joining us. And I think at this point, everyone have a great rest of your week. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation very soon. Thank you all.